Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's bioCADDIE webinar. Today we'll have a presentation on the Dryad Digital Data Repository project from Scherle. And he holds a PhD in computer science and cognitive science. He's built systems for managing a wide variety of digital materials, including a digital music library stored on the world's largest iPod. In his current role as the repository architect for Dryad, he manages the technical development of tools for depositing, storing, and disseminating a variety of scientific and medical data. And if everyone could please make sure to mute your microphones unless you are asking a question. And you can go ahead and get started, Ryan.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. So Dryad grew out of a very simple idea, and that was basically bringing us back to the world that we once lived in. So back in the dark ages, long, long ago, science was published on paper. And in the early days of the paper, all of the data associated with experiments could fit in the actual pages of the journal itself. But as science grew, the data grew as well, and all of the individual details didn't fit on paper. So papers started resorting to presenting summary statistics. And Dryad recognized that scientists really needed access to that full data again, and so we endeavored to start publishing the data online. So here's just a sample of one particular item that is stored in Dryad. Certainly has many thousands of rows, much more than could fit in a typical publication on paper. Dryad really focuses on data that we call orphan data, which is from very small studies, individual scientists, or small groups, not really large volume data that comes off of major machines or off of very large projects with thousands of scientists involved. And these are just a couple of other examples of sort of the breadth of data that we're storing in Dryad. So on the left here, we have some data that we've featured recently. We have a featured data set every week. And this is a social media analysis. And on the right here, we have some data associated, again, with social media, but dealing with the the occurrence of a hurricane. Excuse my cough in my throat here. So historically, for the last 20 years or so, a lot of scientists have said, oh, well, data is available on request, so we don't need to archive it. But there have been a few studies that have shown that that just isn't working very well. So most notably, there was this study done by Wickerts et al. Of American Psychological Association journals, and they went to very extreme measures trying to track down some of the data associated with these publications where it was claimed to be available on request, including actually, sharing their resumes and samples of their intended research with the authors, and they were very rarely able to actually obtain the data. A little bit more recently, there was a similar study done by Tim Vines et al., and they found that over a period of 20 years, the odds of actually being able to obtain the data set that was reported in a paper fell by 17% every year. So the best time to capture data is immediately as an article is being published. There are a lot of reasons for that. After an article is published, the memories of the authors start to fade. Sometimes there are technical difficulties with retaining the actual data itself. There can be catastrophic failures like a hard drive crash or a fire. But even if the best of care is taken, eventually the investigators will move on and that data is not cared for, and especially after the death of the original investigators, it's often very hard to find or interpret data. So Dryad tries to focus at the very top of this curve here, immediately after or during the process of publication of an article, capturing the data associated with it. So as part of the founding of Dryad, a group of journals in evolutionary biology got together and created this joint data archiving policy. And the archiving policy was enacted by a group of major journals in concert so that no one journal was singled out by authors as being too restrictive. And it had a number of points that all of the data associated with a particular article should be deposited in a public archive. The policy does not specify Dryad as that archive, but Dryad was created to be an archive that was always available if there was no other archive that was appropriate for that particular type of data. And in order to enact some of this cultural change and really get a large group of scientists accustomed to depositing their data as part of their publication process, there were a couple of exceptions made, most notably that embargoes could be applied. By default, authors submitting content to Dryad can select a 1-year embargo on the data, 1 year after the paper actually appears, which may be a little bit longer from the time that they submit the data for deposit. Those embargoes can be extended beyond that 1 year with the approval of the associated journal editors. And then there were some notable exceptions added to the policy that if the data is somehow sensitive, especially things like human subjects data or locations of endangered species, then the editors in those journals can simply exempt that data from being published at all. All right, so this policy was really quite successful. It came out and the journals started enforcing the policy very close to the time that the National Science Foundation also started enforcing a policy of data publication for science that they funded. So right here in 2011, we see a moderate jump in data availability as an effect of the NSF policies, and a little bit larger jump as an effect of the JDAP journals. And when we put those together, we got a fairly marked shift in the culture of scientists archiving their data. Now, of course, the process of depositing and archiving the data is not without costs. So the way that Dryad has elected to recover those costs is primarily through partnerships with the journals. So we have a number of journals that have partnered with Dryad in order to sponsor the costs of their data being deposited with us. And we also have a number of organizations, many of whom sponsor data for their journals, but these organizations sponsor Dryad as an organization as a whole, that they have a membership in Dryad where they can vote on the bylaws and guide the direction of the organization. Now, not everything is paid for by the journals. We do have sort of this hierarchy of how data is paid for. So the very first thing that we look at is if the research is being performed by a researcher in a low-income country, then we waive the fees entirely. If that's not the case, then we do look to see whether there is a journal or other institution that is attached to the data being produced that has agreed to sponsor it. And what we've done just within the last couple of weeks, we've rolled out a new pilot project here where data associated with research funded by the National Science Foundation, they have provided a pool of money for us to use in supporting the data that is collected under that research. But of course, if none of these options are available, then we do have a data publication charge that is passed on to the individual scientists doing the submitting. All right, so I like to look at the world of repositories and sort of see where Dryad fits in. So I don't have a large number of repositories represented on this graph, but just to give you sort of an overall idea of what the landscape looks like. So on the horizontal axis, we have the amount of focus that a repository has on a particular type of data, and on the vertical axis, the amount of focus that a repository has on a particular group of users. So traditional supplemental materials associated with a journal are very tightly focused on the users that just have publications in that journal, and they're often fairly restricted in what types of content they will take. On the other extreme, we have Figshare, which is a fairly large, widely known repository that takes pretty much anything. What Dryad does is we try to be as general as possible, but we back off in certain strategic ways from that generality to try to get a little bit more focus on the content that we're collecting. So we will take almost any type of data, but we do highly suggest that people submit data to us in reusable formats. So if someone is submitting a PDF full of numbers, then we say, well, maybe you should submit that as a spreadsheet instead. We also back off from taking data from just anyone. We do have a restriction that all data in Dryad is associated with a published article so that we can have sort of a minimal level of documentation and quality control associated with that data content. Okay, so taking a little bit of a look at the Dryad repository itself. So this is what the homepage looks like. And most people click on the big button to start their submission process. But when they click on this button, they may or may not have already submitted the publication that's associated with the data to their journal. So we have these really two very parallel processes where there's a manuscript being processed by the journal, and in parallel, the data is being associated going through the Dryad publication process. And then there are critical points along the way where Dryad and our partner journals share information. But we do have provisions if the data process still happens, but the links are not quite as explicit. Okay, so a quick overview of what the submission process looks like. We do allow our authors to enter DOIs or PubMed IDs for their articles, and then we can automatically import all the metadata associated with that article if it has been published already. If the article hasn't been published but it is submitted or accepted to one of our partner journals, then the authors can provide the journal name and a manuscript number, and we will have received that metadata in the background directly from the journal, and we can use that to pre-fill a lot of the information in our submission process so that we're not wasting the author's time when they're submitting the data. In fact, if the author has their data files already prepared and in good shape, the actual submission to Dryad takes less than 10 minutes. So this is just showing that we do have a title and a list of authors that was imported from this journal. Farther down the page, that there's more metadata that is also imported, whatever we can get from the journal at that time. Now, I mentioned that we do have a small level of quality control, not just that the data is associated with a published article, but also we do have manual curators that check and verify some very simple things. We make sure that the files are actually able to be opened, that they contain the content that's advertised. We search through the files to make sure that they don't have the kind of information that will be problematic to publish, such as detailed human subjects data or copyrighted content that may not be able to be released under a permissive license. And then once our curators have approved content, it gets published on a page that looks like this. So we do ensure that all of the data that's published in Dryad is titled in association with the article, and the metadata associated with this has a very similar format. It's always data from, colon, and the title of the article. And that ensures when you're looking up this article in Google or some other search system that you can find the data usually right beside the listing for the article itself, and you can tell them apart. We do provide statistics for how often content is used. This particular data item is one of the most popular items in Dryad. It's been downloaded thousands of times. And then we do have this citation block down below that suggests how people should cite the data. We promote citation of both the original article and the associated data as two separate objects, although with relatively similar citations. But we provide in Dryad the capability for the data to have slightly different credits. There can be a different listing of authors here if you had people working on the data collection but not necessarily working on the preparation of the article itself. You can add extra people in, change the order of them. And of course, the links to actually obtain those objects go to two separate places. The article is always hosted at the original publisher's site. We don't host the articles, we only link to them, and then the data itself is located on the Dryad system. So this slide just keeps a little bit of that. So here's an example of a paper and the preferred method for citation. So there's both a reference inline in the text to the data stored at Dryad and a link to the DOI for direct access to that. And then in the references section, we have these references to the data and its associated article. All right, so once content is in Dryad, we make it available through a wide variety of methods. We can have these links directly to the DOI, and we provide some little graphics that individual scientists can use for linking from their homepage out to the Dryad content. But all of our DOIs are, of course, registered with DataCite, and the metadata goes out through the various DataCite channels. So this is from the local U.S. registrar EasyID, and they show the data for this object, along with its relationships to the various pieces of the object and the original article that is associated with that data. Dryad data is harvested or linked from a number of places. So this is a page in Science Direct, and whenever you're opening a page in Science Direct, there's automatically a query that goes to Dryad to see whether there is data associated with that article, and a little box will appear in the side here that provides that link. Similarly, there are Dryad references in GenBank and PubMed. And of course, more recently, we have data being harvested by DataMed. So this is Dryad data being shown in that system. So Dryad has been growing fairly steadily over the last few years. We've had almost every year we've had roughly 40% growth in the number of submissions. As of this morning, we have 13,570 individual data submissions that's associated with that number of articles. So the actual number of files is quite a bit more, but we tend to count the number of full submissions. And just another look at some of the variety, in addition to things that are sort of raw science content, Dryad does have some sort of meta-analysis. So this is a recent article of analysis of the usage of Sci-Hub I wanted to call attention to Dryad's board of directors. We are a nonprofit organization. So all of those journals associate and other organizations that are members of Dryad participate in the governance, and we have a nonprofit board of directors that is elected by the membership, and they serve for a period of 3 years. And excuse me. And I did also want to call attention here to Susanna Sansone, who has been a big supporter of Dryad and is also heavily involved with bioCADDIE. So that's the very quick overview. I did want to sort of leave this as flexible as possible so that I could answer more detailed questions or give demonstrations if anyone was interested. So that's the end of my sort of prepared comments, but I'm very interested in what other people want to hear about Dryad and its relationship to bioCADDIE. and any suggestions that you may have for us moving forward.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for the presentation. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to speak up or type in the chat window. All right, and if there's no further comments, then we will see you back next month for the next bioCADDIE webinar, which will be given by our bioCADDIE's own Jeff Gress, who will be presenting on one of his other projects, DKNet. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you very much, Ryan, for your presentation today.